The German leader and EU Commission President were quick to back Israel as the conflict began with Iran. The EU has since called for de-escalation, reflecting growing anxiety over what might happen next. So what's the thinking in European capitals, and how much influence does Europe really have? This is Inside Story. Hello, welcome to the programme. I'm Neave Barker. Like the rest of the world, European nations are watching anxiously for what happens next in the conflict between Israel and Iran. Some are staunch allies of Israel, while others want its Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu to face trial for war crimes in Gaza. Europe's divisions over Iran are in stark contrast to the unity of a decade ago and its central role in forging the nuclear deal with Tehran. And dramatic changes, too, in the bloc's relations with the US. Warm and close with the Obama administration, frayed and uncertain with the current occupant of the White House, Donald Trump. So what are the views of Europe on this conflict, and what influence does Europe really have on Israel, Iran and the US? We'll try to find out more from our guests shortly. But first, this report from Barbara Angopa.
German's Chancellor Friedrich Merz was quick to support Israel's strikes on Iran on the sidelines of the G7 summit when he accused Tehran of causing global instability.
This is the dirty work that Israel is doing for all of us. We are also affected by this regime. This mullah regime has brought death and destruction to the world, with attacks, with murder and manslaughter, with Hezbollah and with Hamas.
After Israel's attacks began, European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen called Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu to offer her support.
I spoke with Prime Minister Netanyahu today. I reiterated Europe's commitment to peace and stability in the Middle East. In this context, Israel has the right to defend itself. Iran is the principal source of regional instability, and we've always been very clear: Iran can never have a nuclear weapon.
Her strong pro-Israel stance comes despite growing divisions and concern within the EU over Israel's genocide in Gaza. In response, Spain, Ireland and Slovenia, along with non-EU member Norway, moved to recognise Palestinian statehood a year ago. Yet other countries have remained firm backers of Israel despite its actions in Gaza, with Hungary hosting Netanyahu despite a warrant being issued for his arrest for war crimes by the International Criminal Court. Today's division within Europe contrasts to the United Front a decade ago, when it played a central role in the nuclear agreement of 2015. That allowed Iran to have a civilian nuclear program in return for lifting of sanctions. It collapsed after US President Donald Trump pulled out during his first term in 2018. Even among European allies of Israel, there's worry that the conflict with Iran could cause wider instability in the Middle East, pushing up energy prices and creating a new refugee crisis. The EU Foreign Affairs Chief called for a diplomatic solution.
Iran cannot have a nuclear bomb, and diplomacy is the solution to prevent this, and the EU will play its part. I also took note of the support of the EU ministers on the European Union and my involvement in the de-escalation, so I will spare no efforts in this respect.
US President Donald Trump's unilateral stance of dealing with Iran means Europe's influence is much weaker than a decade ago. The consequences of that are adding to anxiety in Europe over what might happen next. Barbara Angopa for Inside Story.
OK, let's bring in our guests now. Pieter Cleppe is the editor-in-chief at BrusselsReport.eu. He joins us from Brussels. Stephen Erlanger is chief diplomatic correspondent in Europe at the New York Times. He joins us from Berlin. And joining us from London is Ellie Geranmayeh. She is Deputy Director of the Middle East and North Africa Programme at the European Council on Foreign Relations. A very warm welcome to all three of you. Stephen, I wonder if I can start with you. To what extent are European views likely to factor into Donald Trump's decision-making right now?
Not a lot. But it is important to find out what Iran is really thinking and what it's prepared to do. Iran's much weaker after this war has begun by Israel. Israel claims it's preemptive. Some people wonder, but Iran is clearly on its back foot. The main issue remains. The U.S. insists, and now the French also insist, on Iran having no enrichment capacity of any kind, even civilian capacity, while the Iranians say that's a non-starter, that we will not give up our enrichment. We're perfectly happy to have inspections to prove that we're not going to build a bomb. So presumably they'd be willing to give up what they have above civilian grade enrichment, which is 3.67%, rather than the 60% that they're actually making now. But Europe, as you say, it has been a bilateral arrangement so far with the United States. So Europe's been on the outside. But at the same time, the United States has been in touch with the so-called E3, Germany, Britain, France, plus the EU, plus Germany. And the idea is to explore whether a negotiating path is now once again viable to end the war.
Ellie, Trump has, of course, a legacy of bypassing Europe, doesn't he? I mean, he unilaterally pulled out of one of the most important diplomatic agreements in modern times, the JCPOA, back in 2018, the product, of course, of years of hard work and tough diplomacy by Britain, France, China, Russia, the United States, plus Germany, all under the auspices, of course, of the European Union. Ellie, what did Europe, do you think, learn from that experience when it comes to dealing with Iran and the Trump administration, the bruising experience of having their hard work suddenly crumble?
Frankly, unfortunately, I don't think they have learned many lessons. They have actually, over the years, lost increasing leverage, not just with the United States, as Steve pointed out, but also with Tehran. For the Iranians, Europe was important for primarily three reasons. One was its ability to influence Washington. And I think what we've all learned from both the first Trump administration and the second is that, unfortunately, the European leaders have very minimal influence on President Trump's thinking on the Middle East, compared, for example, to Mohammed bin Salman of Saudi Arabia or the Emir of Qatar or Netanyahu. Secondly, the Europeans were important because they offered Iran a major economic opportunity and a major economic market. Now, after the US withdrew from the nuclear deal in President Trump's first term, Europe made a lot of noise about creating strategic autonomy and keeping Iran in the deal and providing Iran with economic benefits. Unfortunately, the reality was that European and US economic ties were so strong that most commercial sectors were unwilling to deal with Iran, and European governments were unwilling to do anything in terms of a state-to-state level that was of meaning to Iran. So Europe lost its economic influence as well. And finally, Europe was important because of its ability to put red lines on Israeli military action. And unfortunately, from everything we've seen from Gaza to Lebanon to Syria and now in Iran, is that it's only really the United States that perhaps, and I'll put in brackets here, perhaps could put some caps on the Netanyahu government in terms of its military aggression abroad. And so here, I think that it's going to be really key to see what comes out of this E3 meeting. I think it's positive they're doing this. I've been encouraging them to have this dialogue with the Iranian foreign minister for some time. But the key is, are the E3 coming with very little leverage to present Iran an ultimatum on zero enrichment, or are they coming with an open mind to creating an off-ramp, which both the US can take and Iranians can take, a creative solution to avert the US engaging in war with Iran that will be very, very bad, not just for Iran, but also for the United States, and it will be Europeans that are left picking up the pieces.
We'll get on to that possibility of Europeans picking up the pieces shortly. But Pieter, Trump pulled out of the JCPOA because he wanted to create a deal of his own, didn't he? I mean, that was bigger and better than that of Barack Obama, something he hoped he might possibly win the Nobel Peace Prize for, although that ship seems to have sailed. I mean, Pieter, what have European diplomats been doing since Trump exited the deal to avoid this almost worst-case scenario that we're in right now?
Well, Europe has tried to sort of keep up appearances for a bit, but then it became clear that this deal was basically dead. Israel had always been quite critical towards it, as I understand, because they feared that civilian nuclear use would make it way easier and way quicker for Iran to get to a nuclear bomb. Now we are where we are. Israel has clearly taken the opportunity of the weakness of Hamas and Hezbollah to take action against Iran. And what you now see is, I would say, divisions within Europe. The German Chancellor, he was, I would say, quite close to the position of Israel in his initial reaction, as you also showed in your segment. The French president, Macron, is a lot more guarded. He has warned against regime change. And I think ultimately this is something where European leaders will definitely agree. As much as they loathe the Iranian regime, as much as they want the European hostages that Iran is holding to be released, they understand that chaos in Iran may be much worse than the pretty nasty regime that we have there today. Now, do they have much influence on Donald Trump? Not at all. Iran has just come out saying that they are willing to listen and work with European diplomats, that they don't want to negotiate with the United States. So maybe there's a scope for Europe to get their feet between the door. But I wouldn't bet on it.
All right. So Stephen, so the Iranians sound like they are willing to talk, they're willing to listen. But what about trust right now? It must be at an all-time low. I mean, until recently, of course, Iran had at least some experience when it comes to negotiating with the Trump administration indirectly, given multiple rounds of talks in Oman and Rome. There are, though, many in Iran who believe during those indirect talks the United States was being duplicitous, simply playing good cop, bad cop to Israel. How difficult is it, Stephen, do you think, for the Europeans to salvage much-needed trust right now to help ease tensions with Iran?
Well, I'm not sure I agree with that take. I don't think Iran's problem was trust with the United States. Iran's problem was the United States was making a demand Iran didn't want to accept. I mean, that's not about trust, that's about negotiation. Donald Trump has used the prospect of military intervention as leverage to try to get Iran to the table in a more conciliatory fashion. Now, Iran has always said it's willing to talk. It has never left the table. It does see negotiations as the easiest way to extricate itself from this war, because, as they keep saying, we don't want to talk until there's a ceasefire. We won't talk about our nuclear program until there's a ceasefire. Well, unless they're talking about a nuclear program, the war is going to continue. So I don't really think it's a matter of trust. I think the Iranians really are, in this case, misjudging both the Trump administration and even the Europeans. The Europeans want to be helpful, but the Europeans have no off switch for the war.
Ellie, I'll come to you in a second, but I want to put a question quickly to Pieter. Pieter, do you think the EU feels any obligation to Washington if the United States does decide to go ahead and strike Iran, or perhaps if American troops are attacked by Iran?
I do think if there would be a confrontation between Iran and the US, that you will see European powers, certainly the UK, but also France, siding with with the US. The question is, to what extent would they back up aggressive US action against Iran? The French president has pointed out that it's very difficult to know where that uranium is in Iran. So even if you would deploy tactical nuclear weapons, which was sort of reported, rumored, I'm not sure how reliable that is, but even then you have to know, where it is. So I would say, yeah, Europe will back up to the extent that it is defensive.
Ellie, I mean, you're in London. I mean, the possibility of US direct involvement puts the UK in an extremely tight spot, doesn't it? Given America's so-called bunker-busting bombs that may be used to hit Iranian nuclear targets are currently stationed together with American B-2 bombers in Diego Garcia in the Chagos Islands at a base that's partly shared between the US and the UK. Presumably, the UK could end up facilitating US bombing sorties. I mean, does that sound like something the United Kingdom, Ellie, has the capacity to say no to?
I think you bring up some good points. One is that, the UK really doesn't want to be in this position right now. They would much rather not have the US be dragged into this conflict, because then it will put them in a very, very difficult position of having to decide whether to say yes and engage in this and put the UK troops at risk, not just in the direct operations, but across the Middle East region. Secondly, this is all coming at a time when European leaders have been trying to put more focus, both militarily and politically, on the war in Ukraine. And this is all one big distraction from what they wanted to achieve in Ukraine, especially the UK, that was trying to be one of the forefront countries regarding both the military backing to Ukraine and also the political track underway. So this is going to really absorb a lot of resource and attention. And thirdly, I would say that there is already real echoes across European capitals of, my goodness, is this another 2003 Iraq invasion moment where the US, based on possibly fabricated intelligence, as was the case in 2003, drags a whole bunch of European countries down with it in a unwinnable war, essentially, with a country of over 90 million people. I mean, this is not this is double the size of Iraq at the time of the invasion. We're not talking about a non-state actor like Hezbollah or Hamas. We're talking about a nation state here.
Right.
And there's a real fear here that you don't just go in and strike on a short runway to Fordo and back, but that this might be a prolonged war that drags the US in for weeks, if not for months.
Stephen, I wonder if we can talk about how united or divided the Europeans are at the moment. When Israel began bombing Iran, EU President Ursula von der Leyen was quick to back Israel and call Netanyahu, maintaining that, quote, Israel has the right to defend itself. Iran is the main source of regional instability. I mean, how helpful was it, do you think, Stephen, for the EU chief as head of an organisation that relies upon consensus, as we all know, to unilaterally make a statement that black and white so early on?
Well, it's a very difficult job she has. And, let's not pretend the European Union is actually united on much of anything. They don't agree on Ukraine. They don't agree on NATO. They don't agree on Iran. They don't agree on Israel. They don't even quite agree on Gaza. So it becomes a problem. I mean, the difficulty for the Europeans is that Gaza is creating this enormous moral queasiness. There's this sense of being dragged into the abyss in this endless Gaza war with so many dead, with no sense of an ending, while at the same time, Europe is very committed, and the E3 is very committed to trying to restrict Iran's nuclear program, and very convinced that Iran has been dodging the International Atomic Energy Agency. It has been lying to inspectors. It has been working toward weapons-grade uranium, so much so that it's hard to imagine Iran doesn't want to be considered a threshold nuclear state, even if it doesn't put in the last screws to a dirty bomb. So you have this ambivalence about Israel, but at the same time, there is, as Mertz said in a blunt way, there is support for driving Iran's nuclear program backward toward a civilian or no enrichment at all, because Iran as a nuclear state is unacceptable to the West, to the US, to Israel, to the Europeans. So
Okay,
that's
Ellie,
the ambivalence.
Stephen, you mentioned Mertz there. Ellie, back to you, because Friedrich Mertz also said that Israel was doing the dirty work of Western countries. I mean, dirty work seems to imply something nefarious, potentially illegal even. What does that say to you about some perceptions in European governments towards Iran right now?
So look, there is no doubt, as we've already discussed, there's a lot of bad blood between Europe and Iran right now on a whole host of issues, from their support to Russia in Ukraine, the detention of detainees, what Iran has been doing, escalating on the nuclear program. But the problem is, Europe could walk and chew gum at the same time. It could hold Iran accountable for all of those bad behaviors across the board, but it could also rightfully condemn Israeli action that is breaching international law. Israel has gone in and is striking nuclear facilities that are protected under the IAEA. These are protected by conventions that European governments, including Germany, has signed up to. So why can we not in Europe both call out Israel and Iran at the same time as being chief destabilizers across the region? And I think this is going to be an increasing source of frustration across European capitals, especially if, and I think there's currently a sense of disillusionment here about how quick of a win Israel has had, this euphoria about, wow, look at this intelligence military coup. But this is going to take, it's going to take blood and resources if they are really dedicated to essentially dismantling Iran's nuclear facilities, as Israel has set its agenda on. And it's not going to be a quick win. And the more this war continues, the more the world's attention, by the way, gets turned away from what's happening in places like Gaza and Russia. And as I said, a population of 90 million, if it is under sustained bombardment, is not going to stay in Iran. And we're going to see problems that we've seen in previous civil wars or previous conflicts in the region coming back to Europe.
Ellie, thanks for that point. Building on what Ellie has just said there, Pieter, when it comes to European power potentially being both critical of Israel and Iran, what does it mean for France, for instance, to be both demanding Iran gives up nuclear ambitions with potentially being on the verge of recognising a Palestinian state?
Well, I think too much of the debate focuses on Israel versus Iran. As Stephen also pointed out, I think European powers do not want Iran to get a nuclear bomb, irrespective of Israel. And if you think this true, if Iran would get a nuke, it's likely that Saudi Arabia and Turkey would also at least consider and push for that. Now, if you're the Greek government, do you want that? I don't think so, right? I think there's two different debates here. The one is the debate on, okay, is Israel going way too far in its military action in Gaza? And separately, the debate on, okay, we have an Iran that may be going for a nuclear bomb. Not everybody agrees with that, to be clear. We have a context where Israel is taking action for its own strategic purposes. Now, this is a new context. How do we deal with that? And how do we deal with or limited influence towards the Trump administration?
Well, one of the ways European countries can respond is by pulling what levers that are available to them. I mean, thankfully, after a few days of thought, the consensus in the EU is that the bloc can and will play its part in reaching a diplomatic solution. EU foreign ministers are meeting on June the 23rd. The bloc's expected to conclude that Israel has violated its EU trade agreements due to its conduct in Gaza. 9 EU countries have already called on the Commission to cease trade with Israel. In the last few minutes, I wonder if you can give me short answers here. Firstly, Ellie, does the EU now need to cut trade with Israel?
Look, we have done at ECFR a whole load of work on differentiation. What it can do, and I think what it must do under the association agreement, is look at where there is annexed territory and the trade there, and look at the human rights provisions under the association agreement, and basically put restrictions on trade with Israel according to their own legal regulations on this front. They do it with every other country. I don't see why Israel needs to be an exception to the rule here.
Stephen, you mentioned the thorny issue of consensus within the EU earlier on in our discussion. I mean, do EU member states actually have the consensus needed to reprimand Israel?
Well, perhaps to reprimand, but not to sanction.
And Pieter, is it economically risky, do you think, given trade pressures from the United States for the EU to do anything too deep and too hasty?
Well, you know, sanctions are a failing tool in diplomatic affairs, so I would almost always advise against sanctions. Okay.
In summary, as we reach the end of our discussion, I wonder if I can get you all to give a brief answer to this, because from the ashes of the JCPOA, let's start with you, Stephen. What role could and should Europe play right now?
Well, I think Europe is doing what it should be doing, which is keeping lines of dialogue open to Iran and helping the United States and Israel find a negotiated path to end this war that ensures that Iran never can build a bomb. And that is a very useful thing, and I'm glad they're doing it.
Understood. Ellie, over to you.
Look, as I mentioned at the beginning, the Europeans know how to deal with the Islamic Republic of Iran. They've had 4 decades of experience. So I think if they're going into these meetings with an ultimatum of unconditional surrender for the Islamic Republic of Iran, it's going to backfire. And if their agenda is a Iran without nuclear weapons, the debate inside Iran is increasingly shifting the opposite direction.
And your last words to you, Pieter. What could and should Europe do now in terms of the role it should play?
I think it should play the role of the good cop. Israel and the US can be the bad cop. Europe has to be the good cop, advising the US about the great risks of chaos if there's regime change in Iran and regime collapse, while helping to forge some kind of a deal that avoids Iran getting a nuclear weapon.
Europe clearly at a crossroads. Huge responsibility awaits the bloc and European partners, of course. Fascinating talking to all three of you, Stephen, Erlanger, Pieter, Cleppe, Ellie, Geranmayeh. Thank you so much for joining us on Inside Story. And thank you too for watching. You can see the programme again anytime by visiting our website, aljazeera.com. And for further discussion, go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on X. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. From me, Neave Barker, and the whole team here in Doha, it's bye for now.
Make sure to subscribe to our channel to get the latest news from Al Jazeera.